We are taking a deeper look at DNA cousin matches and what happens when you have cousins marrying cousins. This is also known as endogamy or pedigree collapse. We're going to get into all of that here in just a moment, but first let me introduce myself. My name is Connie Knox. I am a lifelong genealogist here to help you go further faster and factually with your family history research. Now, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notified each time I upload a video. Genealogy TV has a website, a newsletter, and a Facebook page. Make sure you're hooked up with all those. Links are in the description box below. All right, so there is a handout for this for the information access level channel members. If you want to learn more about that, click the join button. And for those who have already joined, you can find the handout in the community tab. All right, we'll talk more about that at the end of the show. This is a footnotes episode, and well, I like to call them footnotes because it's in the footnotes where the real sources are. And today's real source is DNA expert Diahan Southard. She is here to help us understand the difference between endogamy and pedigree collapse and the tools that might help us figure out our DNA cousins as we research our family tree. So let's get over to the interview with Diahan Southard. I am so glad to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us on Genealogy TV. This is your first appearance, I think, here.
First of many, maybe.
I hope so. So today I really want to kind of get a sense. I do get a fair amount of questions about this, and obviously a lot of questions about DNA as we're all trying to, filter through those DNA matches and try and understand the centimorgans. And so today what I really want to talk about is how to understand, first of all, the difference between pedigree collapse and endogamy. And then we'll get a little bit more into it then. So maybe you could jump in and give us a little bit of understanding about the differences.
Sure. Yeah. The simplest way to think about it is that endogamy is essentially pedigree collapse that's happened over and over and over and over and over again. So if you have just maybe one or two instances where you feel like you've got, first cousins marrying each other, or another thing to kind of throw in the mix here is multiple relationships. So if you have brothers who've married sisters, we sometimes call that pedigree collapse. We sometimes call it multiple relationships. So it kind of depends on how people are talking about it too. But those are kind of the same thing where you, instead of having, 4 great grandparent couples, which all of us should have, if you have less than that because people in your genealogy are related to each other, then that's going to be pedigree collapse. Whereas endogamy is that happening over and over and over and over again for years and years and years and years and years.
And where might we see that endogamous relationships?
Well, so it's easiest to identify. Actually, I have some slides. So I want you to think about endogamy in terms of the size of the pieces of DNA that you're receiving and that you're sharing with your DNA cousins. Okay, so think of endogamy like a piece of licorice. So if you were to offer this child a piece of licorice and it was this like one big, nice long piece of licorice, or the same amount of licorice, but just in smaller pieces, which one is the child going to choose like every time?
Exactly.
The big one, right? Like you can reason with them all you want. It's the same amount. They don't care, right? They want the big piece. And I want you to think about DNA in the same way. You want big pieces. So if you share DNA with someone and it's in relatively big pieces, then that means that that DNA came from a recent common ancestor, which means DNA can help us find and identify that ancestor. Well, that's what we want, right? But what happens with endogamy is people are sharing the same total amount of DNA, but instead of sharing one single recent common ancestor, they're sharing multiple more distant common ancestors. And so when we look, like you were saying earlier, like we learn all about centimorgans, right? And we're all about how much do we share with someone, and that helps us determine our relationship. But the truth is the size of the pieces also matter. And so it's important for us to pay attention. So if you're looking at your DNA match list and you've tried to group them, so we teach this a lot, like how to group your matches, or maybe you're using like an auto grouping tool, like they have auto clustering at MyHeritage, and you're wanting to divide up your matches into these nice groups. Well, what happens with endogamy is you can't do that because at some level, most of your match list is related to each other. So if you want to recognize endogamy, it's where you can't find these distinct groups of people that share DNA with each other. So what you have to do then is you're looking at your match and you're asking, how much DNA are they sharing total? That's still an important number. But it's also really important to look at the size of the pieces. Now, all of our companies are giving us one really key piece of information. It's the size of the biggest piece of DNA. So
and we're talking segments here, right?
We're talking segments.
Yes.
But all of them are telling you how big is the biggest one. So if you're at any DNA testing companies, see a match who's sharing 426 centimorgans, you're like, sweet, this is a good match, right? They're sharing a ton of DNA. But then if their largest piece out of that whole 426 is 12 centimorgans, that's totally just endogamy. You will probably never find your relationship to this match because there isn't a single recent common ancestor that's contributed all 426 centimorgans to you. You're sharing because you have the same population group in common.
Now, I know there's some geographic reasons why we might have endogamous relationships. People who were born on an island, for example. So is there any tools out there that can help us see that quickly?
Not necessarily. So there isn't one like surefire, hey, run your DNA through this tool and it's going to help you sort out your endogamous relationships. So it's still very much something that our DNA testing companies are even grappling with, because people who have very endogamous family, like Ashkenazi Jew is probably one of the best examples of this. Mm-hmm. There's no getting away from it, right? Mm-hmm. They can't, because their entire pedigree chart is filled with these kinds of relationships. Mm-hmm. And so our DNA testing companies are actually treating those people a little bit differently. So at 23andMe, Ancestry, and MyHeritage for sure, they're using a slightly different matching algorithm for people who have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So they're running the ethnicity first, and then they're flagging these individuals who have this ethnicity and kind of running them through this kind of separate treatment just for people who have that heritage, because matching is affected certainly by the endogamy, as well as closeness of relationships and things like that. And some companies are kind of handling it better than other companies, but there isn't some kind of like surefire tool that you can use. It's really about educating yourself about things like total amount of shared DNA and segment size that can help you then pick out the matches in your match list that are most helpful and that are likely to yield an actual connection and relationship, and not just, oh, congratulations, you're all from this little tiny town in West Virginia.
Good explanation. I know that, I think it's FamilyTree DNA also has, when you're looking at total centimorgans, I don't think they filter out some of the lower segments. So those centimorgans could be a little higher than expected. Yes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let me actually share with you an example. Let's just start at the beginning. How about, let's do that. We're just talking about basically how different testing companies handle these smaller pieces of DNA. And so Ancestry, in my opinion, is doing this the best because they have this special algorithm that works for all of us, not just people with endogamy, but it's called Timber. And essentially what they're doing is they are looking for those pieces of DNA that don't represent a connecting relationship, but instead represent your population. And they're like cutting them down. So a more detailed explanation of this really revolves around these two ideas. Is you're sharing DNA with someone for one of two reasons. Either you're identical by state, that's what IBS means, because you just share DNA because you belong to the same population, or you're IBD pieces of DNA, which means you're identical by descent. It means you get that DNA from a common ancestor. So when you're sharing IBS pieces of DNA with people, it's because you share a long time ago, kind of very general place or cultural population. What we want, of course, are the IBD segments, which means we've shared them recently and because of a specific place, really a specific ancestor. So this is a little view into Ancestry's Timber algorithm. So this is basically something they run on every single person that's taken a DNA test. And you have kind of your own little timber chart. Like they look through your match list and they're looking for pieces of DNA that are shared by lots and lots and lots of people in their database. So this is essentially my match list, kind of in this kind of graph form. You can see there's these huge spikes where parts of my DNA are matching with tons of people. And so what Ancestry does is they run this timber algorithm and then they cut down my matches into a much more reasonable level. They take out the pieces that are shared with lots and lots and lots of people so that I'm left with pieces of DNA that are more likely to be because of that common relationship. So it's a really powerful tool that they have to try to help kind of solve this problem. Okay, so this is an experience I had with MyHeritage, and I love this company, but they do not have timber. So you are going to see pieces of DNA, especially if you're from an endogamous community, that are small and don't necessarily represent a connection to someone. So this is my grandma, Irma Claudie Reese, and her grandmother was very close to her. And so she was actually half Irish and half Welsh. So I'm sorry, half Italian and half Welsh. And so her Italian side was her maternal side. She's very close to her grandmother and was just very invested in being Italian. Not that she didn't love her Welsh side, but she was like very invested in being Italian. So before she passed away, I had her tested with FamilyTree DNA, which was the only option at the time. And then I've transferred her into MyHeritage. And so it took a long time to find close matches, mostly because my grandma is the first generation American. And for people who are born outside the United States, you just don't have as many DNA matches because not as many people have tested. And so we had a lot of small matches and distant matches. But finally at MyHeritage, we got this close cousin, this Alberto, and they're sharing a lot of DNA, really. I mean, compared to these other matches that we had. And I love at MyHeritage how they tell you where the person is from, that this person was from Italy. And so I got really excited. This was really fun and exciting. And so I reach out to this match, I correspond with his wife, and we basically passed back and forth all of our information. And she had this family story of a relative that came to the US. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's gotta be us. And it was just really, really cool. And so as we're trying to work our match, essentially, what I always try to do is I try to figure out our generation of connection, I call it. So my grandma is much older than this person who was tested. And so we were guessing based on the amount of DNA that was shared that this Alberto would be my grandma's second cousin once removed. Okay, so it was exciting because I didn't know that much about this family. I knew the town they came from. This couple used to live in that town and were currently living 30 minutes outside the town. They knew the mayor of the town. They were like all in with my little research goal here to figure out how we were connected. And so it seemed like we could just figure it out, right? We could just do genealogy. That's what I call it. You just do genealogy to figure it out. Our connection shouldn't be that far back. But the problem is the more genealogy we did, the more we saw we weren't connected there. And it was really confusing for a while because it seemed like we should be connected. And we kept finding more records. They were very helpful, by the way, going to that little town, talking to the mayor, like they found primary records. Like it was an amazing and fun experience, but we still couldn't figure out how we were connected. But it turns out as we look at the chromosome browser at MyHeritage, so the way a chromosome browser works is you can see all the pieces of DNA that you share with someone else. So those numbers over on the side represent the chromosome that you're looking at. And then all the pieces of DNA are pieces of DNA that my grandma shares with this man, Alberto. And so as we're looking at those pieces of DNA, we can see that most of them are very, very small. So this piece right here was really the only piece that was over a threshold that I've drawn. So sometimes I draw a 15 centimorgan threshold, sometimes a 20 centimorgan threshold. If you know you have endogamy, I really encourage you to set a high threshold for the segment size because there's just so much DNA that you're getting from your population. You really want to make sure you're only counting the DNA that came from your shared ancestor. So in this case, basically, most of the pieces of DNA that my grandma shared with Alberto or because they were both from this really tiny town in northern Italy and their families had been in that same town for many, many generations. So if we take a look, I ended up counting these pieces. I was trying to be really generous in our relationship, but even now I'm like, honestly, it could be like 34 centimorgans would be our total shared amount of DNA. And that would make sense.
I'm finding this really interesting. So if this is an endogamous relationship, does that mean that each one of these three segments are from a different relationship up the family tree?
That's a great question. And the answer is we don't know.
Okay.
And there isn't really enough research and scientific evidence to help us know for sure what's going on. But that's why I'm saying, as I've done more and more research helping people with endogamy and more research, even in non-endogamous populations, if you're looking at a fourth cousin, which is what it turns out we are to each other, actually it's fourth cousins once removed. If you look even without endogamy, most of the time people with that relationship share one piece of DNA, one nice piece, like over 20. And then maybe they have another that's 6 or 7 or 8, which may be real, it might not be real. But that's my experience, is that that's just how it works with someone who has a relationship with you like fourth cousin. You're going to share one nice piece of DNA and that's it. And so I would guess, honestly, that only that 34 segment is real and the other 2 are just population based and they don't trace to a specific ancestor, but are just kind of in the population.
Interesting. Really good stuff. Now, I want to think, having just finished your book, that you talked about that family in this book.
Yes. It's such a good awakening for me because it's not something I went to immediately because I didn't think of my family as endogamous because we're not Jewish, right. We're not Akkadian, but yeah, a little tiny town in northern Italy, for sure, we've got endogamy.
Well, I'm pretty confident that probably most families have some sort of pedigree collapse at some point. I know I do. And I didn't even realize it. I had to look at my tree on Ancestry in a couple different ways, like moving myself up and, moving up and down the tree before I spotted, oh, wait a minute, this is the same couple here and here in the tree. And so, yeah, great explanation. Thank you.
No, so the pedigree collapse is a different and in a way more easily solvable problem, even though we kind of conflate the two ideas into the same thing. And sometimes they are, right? It's kind of like, where's the line? If I've got 2, is it just pedigree collapse? If I have 3, is it endogamy? And the answer is, I don't know. It just depends on your family, how you want to treat it. The ideas are the same, but with pedigree collapse, it's a little bit different. And honestly, it's a little bit easier. So I often talk about multiple relationships, just because I think those words make more sense to people than something like pedigree collapse sounds like something more complicated, when really it's just, you have multiple relationships to this person. So if you suspect, or if you know, like you just said, I just saw in my family tree these multiple relationships, that's perfect. As long as you know they're there, we can work around them with the DNA. So the question you really want to ask yourself about is, how many events are we talking about? So if we're looking at these 2 kind of graphs, none of us can go out forever on that triangle. Like if we're at the point, that inverted pyramid, all of us at some point have to go back to each other, right? There just aren't enough ancestors out there for us to all just keep having unique ancestors back into infinity, right? All of us have pedigree collapse, if you want to say that, at some point. Like we have to. There just aren't enough people to go around back there, right? But it really only affects the DNA if your multiple relationships are happening in recent generations. So if you've got, maybe back at your 3 times great grandparents, and that was a brothers married sisters situation, honestly, you're not going to see that much effect from that in your DNA match list right now, because the amounts of DNA you share with fourth cousins are small anyway. And most of the time you won't notice that double relationship. But if it happens much closer, like on that great grandparent, or certainly on the grandparent level, you'll absolutely notice it. So what you want to do if the relationships are closer to you, you want to ask yourself, what two relationships do these cousins have with each other? Okay, so let's take a look at this example. And this is from the book as well. So in this idea, we've got Charlie and Cindy. You can see those ancestors. They're kind of in the middle of the page. We're going to say they're unrelated to each other, which means that Fiona and Fred are going to be second cousins. So we go back, we see their shared ancestral couple. We see that they are second cousins. So that's great. But what if Charlie and Cindy were related to each other? What if Charlie married his first cousin, Cindy, and their common ancestor is this Adam and Anna couple up there at the top? So how does that affect the relationship of Fred and Fiona? Well, number one, they are still second cousins because they still share Charlie and Cindy as their common ancestor. But they have a multiple relationship. They have another relationship. So what is their other relationship? Their other relationship goes back to Adam and Anna, to which they are fourth cousins. So as long as you know the relationships, you can calculate the amount of DNA that you expect to share. And you can start thinking about things like, oh, what if I use the shared matches tool on this match? What kinds of matches would that give me? And you can just start thinking about things in those terms. But this is really all it is. You just ask yourself, what are the two relationships I would have with this person? If this is our relationship, I would be second cousins and fourth cousins.
Good information. Then do we add these centimorgans together?
Yeah. In fact, so if I would, there's another example. So this is just how you do it. So you would write down their relationships to each other, okay? The observed amount of DNA, the expected amount of DNA. You can calculate all of those things using the shared centimorgan project. And basically you would just add up the numbers and you would say, how much DNA would I expect to share if we have these relationships? And it just helps you calculate everything. You just add the two relationships together and it's the amount of DNA that you should share.
And you can also kind of reverse engineer that then.
Exactly.
If you have a suspected relationship.
Exactly. And this is what is so important about amount of shared DNA, especially when we get into situations like people who are looking for biological parents, for example, and they see a match on their match list who's sharing 800 centimorgans. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is a first cousin. That's what we've learned, right? That's what the shared centimorgan project says. That's what happens when you click on that total amount of DNA at Ancestry. They're like, this is your first cousin. Like, oh my goodness, we share grandparents, and then they're off, right? But everybody for every relationship needs to step back and say, sure, we could be first cousins. Or what if we had multiple relationships that would add up to give me 800 centimorgans, but isn't a first cousin? So there's especially in cases of unknown parentage, most of the time, the two people who created you, the baby, were not in a stable, documented relationship, which means there's a lot of possibilities for how that baby came to be. And they aren't going to follow these traditional rules that we like to follow about how much DNA is shared with people with relationships, because so many other explanations exist. And it's so important that we understand that so that we're giving people good information. I know there's so many good people out there who are trying to be search angels, right? And they're trying to help, and they've solved a mystery in their own family, and they're empowered and they want to help, and they hear about their friend or whatever, and they try to help someone, like, oh, a 1700 centimorgan match, it's your half sister, let's contact them. And that's actually not the relationship at all. And so it can just be hard, but it's just important that we're all thinking that, like, every time you're double checking, okay, what if this was a double relationship? Or what if, and I've seen this so many times, that a woman has a baby with her husband's brother. What does that look like in terms of centimorgans? So there's all of these ideas that we just need to kind of put in our back pocket and have there so that we're thinking about them.
Yes, I'm always professing we need to explore all the possibilities. And then
yes,
through the process of elimination, we can usually figure out what the answer is.
That's right.
Great explanation. Thank you. Let me ask you this, because I know on Ancestry, in a lot of those services, they have like, you've got your percentage of shared DNA. And I'm looking at an example here. You've got, say, 208 centimorgans across 10 segments, with the longest segment being 30 centimorgans. So in that situation, we need to not worry so much about the 10 segments being possible endogamy, right? Because we have 30 centimorgans as the, so what's your threshold there as far as the longest segment?
So it's kind of hard, and I wish we had better data, and I think one day we'll have better data. But essentially, if you're sharing, 200 centimorgans, like you're saying, I would expect the biggest piece to be between 20 and 50 centimorgans. Okay. As long as you're above 20 with that biggest piece, you're usually okay. But the bigger the better, for sure, to make sure you're in that relationship range. But if you're only sharing 50 total centimorgans, I mean, sometimes it's all in one piece, but that's really rare. So if you're sharing 50, then I would expect your biggest piece to be more like 20. And that's okay too. So it really depends on how much total DNA you're sharing. And that's just a reflection of how close your relationship is. Really, segment size is a reflection of how close your relationship is. I always think of it like you've got these big centimorgans, right? And you're trying to pass them down to the next generation, but it's like they're getting passed down through a grid, right? And the grid is like a knife. And every time you push the centimorgan, the chromosome through the grid, it's breaking it up into some pieces. So every time it has to go through this grid, and every generation is a new grid. And so the smaller the pieces, the further back it came from, essentially.
Great visual. I like that. That's pretty
Shove
cool.
your centimorgans through a grid.
Through a little screen. Very
through a little screen, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Excellent. Really good. All right. Well, I do want to help you out here. If you guys want to learn more, she's got a book out, Your DNA Guide, and a website by the same name, if I recall.
That's right. So yeah, on our website, we've got lots of free downloads. So if you want to kind of dip into this a little bit and learn a little bit more, we have free download about ethnicity. If you are searching for biological parents, we have a free download about that. We have a free download about contacting your matches, which is such a big deal, right? We have to reach out and contact your matches. Also, just like 4 next steps you can take with your DNA match list. So those are the like freebies that we've got there that you can kind of check out what we do. And of course, the book.
Great examples in the book as well. I'll leave a link to the book and to the website in the show notes for everyone to get to. I really appreciate it. This has been great. Anything else you want to share? Any upcoming events for you? Are you going to be speaking anytime soon?
Well, you can see all my events on my website, and I am speaking a lot all the time. So you can always go there and find out. Plus, if you sign up for our newsletter, which is free, then you get tips every month that we send out, as well as information about where I'm speaking. You can follow us on social media. So I'm on Instagram and Twitter. I have a YouTube channel also. So like that's a good way to keep up with everything that we're doing as well. But my advice, I guess, is that you can do the DNA. That's what I keep telling everyone. Like if you're here watching this, then you have an interest, and that's all it takes. And it's little by little, step by step, repetition, but you'll get it. And you can make some significant discoveries about your family using this technology.
I also remind everybody that we can't use DNA alone. We really need to do the traditional genealogy research in combination with DNA to really seal the deal, I guess, and learn about our relationships. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really
of course. Thank you for having me.
Hey, there's more information about Diahan Southard in the description box below. As a reminder, there is a handout for this episode. And well, click the join button if you're not a member and join at the information access level to get that handout. Now, remember, if you're already a channel member, you have to go to the community tab to access that. Just look for the one with the big letters that say handout. All right, there are more videos on the screen now for your binge watching pleasure, and maybe one about DNA. All right, enjoy the genealogical journey.